Nobody at an air show thinks they are in danger. You bring your family, you find a good spot near the fence, and you look up. The pilots are the ones taking the risk, not the crowd. At least that is how it is supposed to work. Then a turn comes in too low, and a perfect afternoon turns into something nobody can take back. These are the shows that ended in tragedy. The crowd had come to celebrate. Families gathered at a military airfield outside Lviv in western Ukraine to mark the 60th anniversary of an Air Force Corps. More than 10,000 people turned out that Saturday, and many of them stood close to the flight line with their children for the best possible view. Within a couple of hours, 77 of them would be dead. The main attraction was a Sukhoi fighter, one of the most powerful jets in the Ukrainian arsenal, flown by 2 experienced military pilots. Their plan was an aggressive low-level routine meant to show the aircraft at its limits, full of rolls and tight turns right above the field. Almost nothing about the flight had been prepared properly. The crew was later found to have been working from information that did not match the real airfield. They had asked for a practice run over the site beforehand and been refused. The zone set aside for their maneuvers was too small for what they intended to fly, and the spectators had been allowed to stand far closer than any safety rule should have permitted. For the first minute or so, the display looked spectacular. Then the pilots took the jet into a descending half-loop, rolling it as they hauled it back toward the ground. They had started too low. As the fighter came around, it was still sinking fast, and there was no height left to save it. In the final moment, the left wing dipped and caught the ground at the edge of the field. What happened next took only seconds. The jet slammed down, slid across the grass, and clipped the nose of a parked transport plane before erupting into a fireball and cartwheeling straight into the crowd. Both pilots ejected at the last instant and survived with minor injuries. 77 were killed, and more than 500 were hurt. It remains the deadliest airshow disaster ever recorded, and it played out in broad daylight, before thousands of witnesses and dozens of cameras. The investigation placed most of the blame on the crew, who had drifted outside their approved zone and attempted a maneuver they could not safely complete at that height. The aircraft itself was working normally. Officials who let the audience stand so dangerously close were faulted as well. The lead pilot always insisted he had been handed a bad flight plan and a map that did not match the ground, and he maintained to the end that something had gone wrong with the engines. The courts did not accept it. He was sentenced to 14 years in prison, his co-pilot to 8, with several officers convicted alongside them. The maneuver was called the Pierced Heart. 2 groups of jets would trace a giant heart in the sky. As they swept apart, a single aircraft would race up through the gap to pierce it, heading straight toward the crowd. It was the signature finale of Italy's Air Force display team. Beautiful and precise, performed hundreds of times without trouble. At a packed airfield in West Germany, it went wrong in a matter of seconds. Tens of thousands of people had come to Ramstein Air Base, an American installation near Kaiserslautern, for an air show in the summer of 1988. The headline act was the Frecce Tricolori, the Italian Air Force display team, flying 10 sleek Aermacchi jets that trailed red, white, and green smoke. People had been waiting all afternoon for them. Many in the crowd pressed up close to the flight line, in what was considered the best view in the house, only a short distance from where the jets would perform. The display had gone beautifully. The 10 jets split into smaller groups and carved their shapes across a clear sky, while the audience watched and cameras rolled. For the finale, they set up the Pierced Heart. One group curved out to the left, another to the right, and the 2 arcs began racing toward each other to close the bottom of the figure. A lone jet lined up to thread the gap between them. The whole routine was being flown barely 150 feet above the ground, which left almost no margin for a mistake. The solo pilot came in too early and far too low. Instead of passing through the gap a few seconds later and well above the other jets, he arrived at the exact moment the 2 groups were crossing, and at nearly the same height. He could not climb away or slow down in time. His aircraft slammed into the lead jet of one group and tore off its tail, and that crippled jet spun into a third aircraft beside it. In an instant, 3 jets were falling out of the sky. What happened next took less than 7 seconds. The lead jet of the group came down near the runway and destroyed an emergency medical helicopter waiting on the ground, fatally burning its American pilot, who held on for 20 days before he died. Its own pilot ejected, but he was far too low, and he hit the ground before his parachute could open. The third jet exploded in a fireball beside the runway and killed its pilot on impact. The worst of it was the aircraft that had started the chain. Wrapped in flames and completely out of control, it carried across the runway on a flat trajectory and struck the ground right in front of the spectator stands. It burst into a fireball, cartwheeled through a wire fence, crossed an access road, and plowed directly into the densely packed crowd before coming to rest against a parked ice cream van. The people standing there had been given what looked like the best seats at the show. They had almost no time to react, and nowhere to go. 70 people were killed. 3 of them were the display pilots, and the other 67 were spectators who had simply come to enjoy a day out. Many died at once, struck by burning wreckage and flying debris. Others held on for days or weeks with terrible burns before they too were lost. More than 300 suffered serious injuries, and hundreds more were hurt. The entire catastrophe, from the first contact in the air to the fireball in the crowd, had unfolded in front of everyone in under 7 seconds. Ambulances were held up at the gate. The true scale of the disaster went unrecognized for nearly an hour, and even basic medical equipment did not match between the two sides. Lessons from that failure later reshaped how both countries handle mass casualties. Investigators concluded that the solo pilot had flown his pass too low and too early, with no room left to recover once the jets converged. Later claims of a technical fault or even sabotage were examined and dismissed for lack of any evidence. The aircraft had been working exactly as it should. The tragedy came down to a few seconds of misjudgment, flown at low altitude over a crowd that had been allowed to stand far too close. Ramstein changed airshows across Europe for good. New rules pushed display flights well away from spectators, and banned maneuvers that sent aircraft pointing toward the crowd. It had taken 70 lives to teach a lesson that now protects everyone who stands at a fence and looks up. This was not a gentle display of formation flying. The Reno air races were billed as the fastest motorsport on Earth, a competition where heavily modified warbirds tore around a desert course only 100 feet off the ground at speeds approaching 500 miles an hour. The crowd loved it. On this September afternoon in Nevada, one of those planes left the course and came straight for them. The aircraft was a North American P-51 Mustang, a single-seat fighter from the Second World War named Galloping Ghost. It had been built in 1944 and had spent decades as a racer under various owners before the man flying it that day bought it in the 1980s. He was a 74-year-old professional pilot who had been competing at Reno since then, still sharp and still hungry to win. He had poured years into rebuilding this airplane to chase the championship. To make it faster, he had modified it heavily. He fitted a new engine and a custom cooling system, built a new canopy, and even cut more than 4 feet off each wingtip to save weight. He also changed the pitch controls, replacing the original trim system with an electric motor on the left side and locking the right trim tab so it no longer moved. Experts later judged it one of the most heavily modified Mustangs ever to fly. The trouble was that almost none of these changes had any paperwork. There were no design drawings, no strength calculations, and no proper flight testing on record. Hidden inside that left trim tab was a flaw years in the making. The small lock nuts that held the attachment screws had not been replaced since at least 1985, and their threads had worn smooth. With nothing holding them tight, the screws could wiggle back and forth in flight, and over time a fatigue crack had quietly spread through one of them. Nobody knew it was there. Days before the race, mechanics noticed the screws on the locked right tab had worked loose and tightened them, but no one asked why the screws kept loosening, and no one checked the left side at all. The unlimited class race began that afternoon with thousands of fans watching from the grandstands and box seats beside the course. A group of safety investigators happened to be in the crowd as well, enjoying the show. Galloping Ghost started near the back, the pilot using his usual tactic of charging up through the field, and by the third lap, he had climbed into third place. Then everything came apart in seconds. As he passed one of the pylons, the airplane hit the wake of the plane ahead and rolled hard. At that exact moment, the worn left trim tab began to flutter, a violent high-speed vibration that the cracked, loose screws could no longer contain. In less than a second, the flutter tore the linkage apart and forced the trim tab far past its limits, snapping the Mustang into a savage climb. The sudden pull subjected the pilot to more than 17 times the force of gravity. The blood drained from his head, and he was knocked unconscious instantly. As the plane shot upward and rolled, the cracked screw finally failed completely, and the left trim tab broke away. Galloping Ghost nosed over and turned back toward the earth, pointed directly at the packed seating area. Traveling at more than 500 miles an hour, it dived on the crowd with almost no time for anyone to move. About 9 seconds after the trouble began, the Mustang slammed nose first into the box seats in front of the grandstands and disintegrated. A storm of wreckage tore through the spectators, throwing debris, chairs, and people in every direction. 11 people were killed, including the pilot, and at least 69 more were injured. It was the deadliest airshow accident in the United States in nearly 40 years, and one of very few in which spectators died. Because investigators had watched it happen, the inquiry began within minutes. They traced the cause to that worn-out trim tab, The decades-old lock nuts had let the screws loosen. A fatigue crack had weakened one beyond saving. And at racing speed, the result was uncontrollable flutter. The pilot's own modifications had made it worse. By disabling the right trim tab, he had piled extra stress onto the left one and removed any way to counter the violent pitch-up. None of the changes had been properly tested or reported, and inspectors had never examined them. There was one more factor that turned a crash into a massacre. The seating was only about 750 feet from the course. Had the spectators been kept the full 1,000 feet back that one set of rules called for, the Mustang would have hit empty ground. After the disaster, the races tightened their engineering reviews, pushed the crowd farther from the course, and began training pilots to handle high-G maneuvers. The event still runs today, and no spectator has been hurt since. Most of the people who died that day had not come to watch the air show. They were driving down a main road beside the airfield, on their way to a football match or a wedding or just a Saturday errand, when a vintage fighter jet came down on top of them. It was the worst British airshow disaster in more than 60 years, and the victims were not spectators at all. They were simply passing by. The aircraft was a Hawker Hunter, a sleek British fighter from the 1950s that had long since retired from military service and now flew the airshow circuit as a warbird. This particular jet had first flown for the Royal Air Force in 1955, and after decades in uniform, it had spent years thrilling crowds at displays around the country. The weather was warm and clear, and the Hunter opened the days later flying at Shoreham on the south coast of England before thousands of spectators. At the controls was a highly experienced pilot, a former Royal Air Force flyer and airline captain with more than 12,000 hours in the air. He began his routine with a fast low pass down the runway, turned and came back for more. Then he pulled the Hunter up into a loop, climbing and rolling over to come back down the other side. It is a classic display maneuver, and he had flown it many times. This time, something was badly off. A loop like that needs height and speed to work. The Hunter should have entered the climb at around 500 feet and well over 300 knots, then reached roughly 4,000 feet at the top before coming back down with room to spare. Instead, the jet started far too low and too slow. One aviation expert later said the entry height left no room at all for a misjudgment. It never got high enough or fast enough over the top, and as it came back down toward the ground, there was no longer any way to pull out in time. The Hunter came over the top and dived toward the earth, nose high but sinking fast, aimed straight at the busy road running alongside the airfield. It struck the westbound carriageway in a massive fireball. The aircraft broke into 4 pieces on impact and tore through the traffic, destroying a line of cars as escaping fuel ignited into a wall of flame and black smoke. The whole thing was caught on camera by spectators, and even by a dash cam in a car driving straight toward the scene. 11 people on the ground were killed. Among them were 2 young footballers on their way to a match, and the chauffeur of a wedding car that was heading off to collect a bride. 16 more were injured. The pilot was thrown clear of the wreckage, still strapped into his ejection seat, which was still live, and posed a danger to the rescuers who reached him. He survived with critical injuries after weeks in hospital. The people on the road had no warning and no chance to escape. The investigation by Britain's Air Accident Branch found no fault with the aircraft itself. The Hunter had been responding normally to its controls right up to the impact. The cause was pilot error. He had begun the loop too low and too slow, and he had not recognized in time that there was no safe way to complete it. There was no black box on board, so investigators pieced the flight together from the flood of photographs and videos taken by the crowd. There had been warning signs before that day. At other shows, the same pilot had been seen flying too low or too steep, and on at least one occasion, a display director had ordered him to stop mid-routine. Investigators also found the jet had taken off with safety equipment that was past its expiry date. None of it had been enough to keep the Hunter on the ground. What happened afterwards stretched on for years. The pilot was charged with the manslaughter of all 11 victims, and his defense argued that the intense forces of the maneuver had left him cognitively impaired and unaware of his height. In 2019, a jury found him not guilty on every count. Years later, a separate inquest reached a harsher conclusion, ruling that the victims had been unlawfully killed and describing the flying as exceptionally bad and the show's safety planning as not fit for purpose. The disaster reshaped air shows across Britain. Civilian Hunters were grounded, and vintage jets were barred from flying aerobatics over land, limited instead to gentle flypasts. When 2 warbirds collided over Dallas in front of thousands of families, the organizers asked themselves whether something in their safety procedures had failed. The real answer was harder to face. The problem was not that the procedures were flawed. It was that no real procedures existed at all. It happened on a clear November afternoon at an airport just southwest of downtown Dallas, during a show put on by the Commemorative Air Force, a beloved nonprofit that keeps old military aircraft flying. These are the planes people drive for hours to see, the surviving giants of the Second World War, restored and maintained by volunteers who love them. On this day, the crowd had come to watch a warbird parade, a procession of vintage aircraft sweeping past the stands in formation. Two planes sat at the heart of the tragedy. The first was a Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress nicknamed Texas Raiders, a 4-engine heavy aircraft and one of only a handful still airworthy anywhere in the world. It carried 5 crew that afternoon, all seasoned aviators and devoted to these machines, including 2 retired airline captains and an elderly Navy veteran who had actually served aboard this very airframe decades earlier. The second was a Bell King Cobra, a single-seat fighter flown by one pilot, a veteran airman with tens of thousands of hours in the air. His was the only surviving example of its kind in the world. The performance that day was something called an air boss-directed routine, and understanding it is the key to understanding the disaster. In a rehearsed display, like the kind flown by the Blue Angels, every pilot has practiced each move hundreds of times and knows exactly where everyone else will be. This was not that. Here, the 8 aircraft in the parade were guided in real time by a single person on the ground, the air boss, who called out instructions over the radio as the show unfolded. The pilots had not rehearsed the routine. They were simply following live commands, flying patterns made up on the spot. The larger planes were told to fly down one line in front of the crowd, the fighters down another, closer line. To get the faster fighters into position, the air boss directed them to cut in front of the slower group. That single instruction was the trap. To reach their assigned line, the fighters had to cross directly through the path of the others. Nothing in the plan kept the 2 groups at different heights, and nothing kept them safely apart. They were threaded through the same piece of sky at the same moment, and the only thing meant to prevent a collision was the hope that the pilots would see each other in time. As the maneuver played out, the 2 faster fighters slid into position, but the King Cobra swung wider, trying to reach the line closest to the crowd. That wide arc carried it straight toward the B-17. The fighter was banked steeply to the left, its belly turned toward Texas Raiders, which sat below it, and to the right. From that angle, the pilot almost certainly could not see it. Coming across from behind and above, the King Cobra sliced into the larger aircraft just behind the wings and cut it in 2. It happened in an instant, in full view of the crowd and a forest of cameras. The fighter vanished into an eruption of metal. The B-17 broke apart, its tail shearing away as the front half pitched down and fell. Both aircraft dropped to the airfield and burst into flames near the runway. There was no time for anyone aboard to react. All 6 crew across the 2 planes were lost. By a small mercy, no one on the ground was hurt, but the people watching had just seen 6 members of a tight-knit community die in front of them. The investigation that followed dug deep, and what it found was damning. The air boss had no radar and no tracking tools. He judged the position of every aircraft by eye, from the ground, and he expected the pilots to keep themselves apart by simply seeing and avoiding one another. He had not assigned the groups to separate altitudes. In fact, he believed assigning altitudes was a distraction and avoided it on principle. He had set the 2 formations on paths that crossed, then trusted everyone to sort it out in the air. When asked afterward who was responsible for keeping the planes apart, his answer amounted to everyone and no one. The deeper the investigators looked, the worse it got. The air boss role required only minimal qualifications, with no recurrent testing and little federal oversight. The man directing the show had begun this work as a teenager and had run hundreds of shows the same way, and almost no one in the community thought it was strange. Just 2 weeks earlier, at a sister show in Houston, pilots had complained about dangerously close passes under the same loose style of direction, and one had even warned that someone was going to get killed. Nothing changed. There were quieter failures, too. Texas Raiders still wore its original wartime camouflage, olive paint designed long ago to make it hard to spot from above against the ground. It did its job. From the cockpit of the diving fighter, it would have been nearly invisible against the earth below. And of the 3 fighter pilots, only the leader was ever asked whether he had the larger plane in sight. No one ever asked the man in the King Cobra. In the aftermath, the organization and the aviation authorities moved to make sure it could not happen again. New guidance banned the kind of free-flowing mixed formation passes that had put the 2 groups on crossing paths. Investigators called for real separation plans, for proper training and oversight of air bosses, and for standard language on the radio, so a vague instruction could never again send 2 priceless aircraft into the same patch of sky. 6 experienced aviators had died, along with 2 irreplaceable pieces of history, because everyone had assumed that the way things had always been done was safe enough. The people who died that afternoon were were not standing at the airfield fence. They were sitting inside an ice cream parlor across the road, mostly children, celebrating after a youth football game, when a Korean war jet came through the front wall. For years, it stood as the worst air-to-ground disaster in American history, and it began with a takeoff that went wrong in seconds. The weekend event was the Golden West Sport Aviation Airshow at Sacramento Executive Airport in California. Among the aircraft on display was a Canadair Sabre, a swept-wing fighter from the early jet age, privately owned and flown by a pilot who was leaving the show to fly the jet onto another airport. On a clear, cool Sunday afternoon, he lined up on the runway and pushed the throttle forward. The Sabre never climbed. This particular type of fighter had a well-known and dangerous quirk on takeoff. If the pilot raised the nose too soon, before the jet had the speed to fly, the wing would lose its grip on the air and the plane would mush along, unable to climb. The danger had been understood since the 1950s. Witnesses watching that day saw the nose come up too early, and the jet simply refused to leave the ground. Running out of runway, the Sabre overran the end of the airfield and kept going. It crossed a busy boulevard at around 150 miles an hour, struck a moving car, and then plowed into a Farrell's ice cream parlor packed with families. Inside were members of a junior football team and their relatives, there to celebrate the day. The jet hit the building in a burst of flame and tore it apart. The toll was staggering. 22 people on the ground were killed, 12 of them children, and around 28 more were hurt. One 8-year-old boy survived but lost 9 members of his family in a single instant, including both parents, his brothers, a sister, his grandparents, and 2 cousins. A pair of people died in the car that was struck out on the road. The pilot, by grim irony, walked away with only a broken arm and a broken leg. It could have been even worse. The Sabre had been slowed by the car and the vehicles parked outside before it reached the building, and its external fuel tanks had ripped away before impact. Without those small mercies, the fire and the death toll might have been far greater. The cause came down to that fatal takeoff. The fighter had been flown into the air before it was ready. The nose lifted too soon, and a known handling trap did the rest. There was nothing wrong with the engine. The tragedy grew out of a vintage warplane being operated close to the public with too little margin for a simple mistake. The disaster left a long shadow. Dozens of lawsuits followed, and the rules around flying old military aircraft and qualifying their pilots were tightened in its wake. Because the burn victims that day had to be flown all the way to San Francisco or Los Angeles for treatment, the city later built its own dedicated burn unit, which has saved countless lives in the decades since. A memorial now stands on the spot where the ice cream parlor once welcomed families through its doors. The crowd that gathered on the Belgian coast that weekend had come for a celebration of flight, and the act they were waiting for was one of the best in the business. The Royal Jordanian Falcons were a display team famous across Europe for their precise, low-level aerobatics. Around 50,000 people had traveled to the seaside airport at Ostend for the annual show, drawn by heavy advertising and the promise of a perfect summer day out. By the end of that afternoon, it would become one of the worst peacetime disasters in Belgian history, and the town would never host an air show again. The aircraft was an Extra 300, a small and nimble propeller plane built for one purpose, to throw itself around the sky. In skilled hands, it can spin, roll, and tumble in ways that leave a crowd breathless, and that was exactly the point. At the controls was a 28-year-old captain from the Jordanian Air Force, a respected aerobatic pilot who had won praise and prizes at shows across the world. He was flying the team's solo routine, listed in the program as the showstopper that the audience had been waiting for. The weather was turning against everyone. The afternoon had been troubled by rain and low cloud over the coast, and the air above the field was unsettled. As the little plane danced through its display close to the ground, it was already working with very little margin for error. Then, at around 10 to 5, it went wrong in seconds. The pilot took the aircraft into a maneuver that called for a near-vertical dive toward the runway, intending to pull up and climb away into the next figure. He lost control on the way down. Witnesses described the plane dropping almost straight toward the earth, and although he fought in the final moments to haul the nose up and recover, there was simply not enough height left. The aircraft could not come out of the dive. The Extra slammed into the ground close to the public area and instantly caught fire. This was the cruelest part of the whole tragedy. The burning wreckage tore directly into a Red Cross first aid post that had been set up right in front of the spectators. The one place meant for treating the injured was sitting in the path of the fireball. Among those killed there were a French visitor and his young daughter, who had come to the tent only to have a small cut looked at. The pilot died on impact. 8 people from the crowd were killed at the scene, and the following day a 19-year-old Red Cross volunteer died of his injuries, bringing the toll to 10. More than 50 others were hurt. most of them with severe burns. Eyewitnesses described a scene of horror, with people on fire and screaming, and a small child of 2 or 3 among the terribly wounded. The emergency plan was thrown into action at once, with ambulances and a rescue helicopter shuttling the injured to hospitals, but the response was nearly overwhelmed. The phone lines jammed so completely that officials were reduced to writing notes by hand and sending them across the city on police motorbikes. The disaster shook the country. The Belgian king and queen cut short their holiday to visit the survivors, and the Jordanian queen came in the days that followed to see the victims as well. The second day of the show was cancelled within hours, and an air show was never held at Ostend again. The cause was never fully pinned down, and this is where the story becomes frustrating. Because the pilot died in the crash, he could never be questioned, and investigators were left to work backward from wreckage and witness accounts. Belgian prosecutors and experts came to a broad conclusion that the pilot had taken too great a risk, flying a demanding routine too low and too hard, while setting aside some of the safety limits meant to protect the crowd. Beyond that, what exactly happened inside the cockpit in those final seconds has never been established for certain. There was speculation at the time about a sudden gust of wind in the unsettled weather, or a possible problem with the engine, but neither was ever confirmed. What is clear is that the aircraft was a capable machine, and the man flying it was skilled. What turned a fatal mistake into a massacre was how close it all unfolded to the people who had only come to watch, and the bitter chance that placed a medical tent directly in the firing line. The legal fight over who was to blame dragged on for years. The flight director and the safety observer were eventually cleared, and almost a decade after the crash, a civil court ruled that the regional authority running the airport, along with several insurers, bore responsibility, awarding damages to the families and the injured. There is something that sets these tragedies apart from almost every other kind of air disaster. They were not hidden. They did not happen in the dark over an empty ocean or on a remote mountainside where the only record is a flight recorder pulled from the wreckage months later. They happened in daylight, in front of families, with thousands of people watching and countless cameras rolling. That is the strange and terrible nature of an air show. It puts the danger right where everyone can see it. The cameras are a part of this story too. In years past, a disaster like one of these might have left behind only a few blurred photographs and a column of newspaper print. Now almost every person in the crowd is holding a recording device, and every second of the worst moment is captured from a dozen angles at once. That footage is painful to watch, but it is also why investigators could piece together exactly what went wrong, often within hours rather than years. The same lens that turned private grief into something the whole world could see also became one of the most powerful tools for understanding it. And when you look back across all of these events, a pattern starts to emerge. In most of them, the machine was not the villain. The aircraft were doing what they were built to do, right up to the final second. What failed was human. A maneuver started too low, a turn flown too tight, a crowd allowed to stand too close, a plan that was never really a plan at all. Again and again, the margin that should have protected the people on the ground had quietly been shaved away long before anyone left the runway. That is the hard lesson buried in these stories. An air show is a celebration of skill and machinery, and most of the time it is exactly that, a wonderful day out. But the very things that make it thrilling, the speed and the low passes and the closeness, are the things that leave no room for a single mistake. A racing driver who loses control has barriers and runoff and open track. A display pilot a few hundred feet above a packed crowd has none of that. When everything goes right, you remember it for years. When one small thing goes wrong, there is often no time and no space to recover. It is also worth sitting for a moment with who actually paid the price. In disaster after disaster, it was not the person who chose to take the risk. It was a spectator near a fence, a driver on a road who had no idea a show was even happening nearby, children inside an ice cream parlor, volunteers in a first aid tent of all places, struck down in the one spot meant for saving lives. These people had come to watch, or were simply going about their day, and they trusted that someone, somewhere, had done the quiet work of making it safe. In that sense, these disasters are not really about flying at all. They are about responsibility, and what happens when that trust is misplaced. If there is any comfort to be found, it is that few of these tragedies were ever truly wasted. Almost every one of them forced to change. Crowd lines were pushed back. Reckless maneuvers were banned outright. Rules were rewritten, aircraft were grounded, training was overhauled, and the way shows are run was reshaped so that the same mistake could not be made the same way twice. In some cases, entire shows were ended forever, the price judged simply too high to pay again. The safety we take for granted at an air show today was bought in large part with the lives of the people you have just heard about. Every barrier and every rule is a kind of memorial, written in the language of regulation rather than stone. That progress matters because the alternative to learning from these days is repeating them. History shows that when the lessons were ignored, when a near miss was waved off as bad luck rather than a warning, the same patterns came back around and claimed more lives. The shows that survived are the ones that listened. Thank you for watching. Take a moment to subscribe so you do not miss the next one. We will see you in the next video.